So one of the things I want to, I guess, start with is the US immigration system primarily is focused here on regulating whether and when a person is able to work in the US. There's an aspect of it, obviously, that regulates whether you can enter the US. And a lot of people, especially in this chat, are likely coming here because they're entering the US to study in the US. But the part of this that I'm focused on now in our call and our conversation, because it relates to startups, is how you work in the US. And there is a distinction between owning a company and working for the company. And that's an important thing to think about throughout what we talk about, whether you're in school, have graduated from school, have started working for one employer or another employer, are here as a visitor, whatever other ways in which you might be physically in the US, the question of whether you can own a business is different from the question of whether you can work for the business. That first question, whether you can own a business, is a very simple question. The answer is basically yes, right? There are structures of companies that we create or can be created in the US, and some of them can be owned by foreign nationals and others cannot. But that's really a tax question. Philosophically, yes, you can own a business in the US. You can do that in the same way, if you think about it, as you can own shares, right? You can buy shares in Apple, and now you own Apple, some small portion of it, but still you own it. And it doesn't matter if you're not in the US, if you're in the US, if you're studying in the US, if you're working for another employer in the US, you can own that business. And that's the same if you own 100% of that business or if you own 1% of that business, right? So I guess the first step on many people's journey in the startup world is, hey, I'm going to found this company. And so the first question, actually, that may not be true. The first step may be, I have an idea and I'm working on my idea. I'm sitting in my garage or in my dorm room or wherever it might be. And I'm coming up with what I think is a problem that I can solve. Fair enough. A lot of that work, a lot of that activity, shall we say, is activity that you're performing in your mind, performing in your bedroom, performing in your garage before there's even a company, before there's even a real idea of a company existing. But at some point, you get to this inflection point of, yeah, this idea is real. This is something I really want to work on. And at that point, perhaps the first step is, hey, can I found this company? Maybe it's by yourself. Maybe you have some co-founders, but hey, I want to be a part of founding this company. My answer to that, whenever anybody talks to me about it, whenever we have clients, whenever we have discussions, is the answer to that is very simply yes. Sure, you can found the company. You could be 50% owner. That's the easy question. The hard question is, or the harder question is, how do I start working for the company? And for some people, it may be enough to be able to be the owner for now, right? I'm a student, I'm still in school. I have a couple co-founders. We want to get started on this company. We want it to exist. I want to be a part of it. I want to be a founder, start with some 30% ownership interest. I'm okay right now, just having it founded. My co-founders are going to do some day-to-day work on it. I'm not going to get involved until I finish graduation or until I get to some other external point or step. So, okay, I can own the business. So that's an important thing to think about as we talk about these other aspects. Ownership is different from employment, and ownership is generally okay. But then I kind of want to divide up how we're talking about what to expect and when you might be able to work for these companies by the different phases you probably will go through in your kind of journey in the US. I expect that most of the people on this call are people that first came into the US, or if not first, at least most recently came into the US as a student, right? Most likely, probably, you're here in F1 status. F1 status allows you to go to a school for as long as that school has a degree program and you're working toward that degree, whether it's associates or bachelor's or master's. Possibly, I mean, at least in the previous interactions I've had with a lot of people in this kind of UB startup community, it's usually the case that the most of you guys are in graduate school, right? You're in some sort of master's program, but that doesn't really impact anything that I'm talking about here. It could be true if you were in an associate's program or a bachelor's program. And so you're here, you're attending school. One of the requirements of maintaining your F1 status is that you're actually full-time attending school. If you're going to drop down to part-time study, it could potentially be an issue, right? So one thing that you've got to always keep into consideration is I got to continue to be a full-time student. But then while you're still in school, before you've graduated, what can you do to potentially start working on a startup? Like I said earlier, the first thing is you could be an owner, get the company founded, keep going to school, keep going to classes, keep going the same things that you're doing already. But yes, now you're an owner. Okay, so then how do I start doing some work for the company? There are a couple of different ways before you graduate that you might be able to do work for the company, right? The two big, I guess, off-campus work authorization paradigms are CPT, which is curricular practical training, and OPT, which is optional practical training. So for CPT, this is a scenario where you're basically setting up with your degree program, right? With the actual major that you're in, with the department that is providing you with that major, that this employment, this usually they think of as internship, is something that's required for my graduation. It is something you get credit for in your actual education. You'll do an independent study course or maybe a different course that you're actually getting credit for as part of the program, which means that the department has to actually review what you're going to do, authorize it, right? And kind of say, yeah, sure, you can get credit for this. Usually that means there's some sort of agreement between the company that's giving you the employment and the school, the department. Maybe there's some internship agreement, either the DSO, designated school official for immigration at your school, or an actual department chair is going to review some document related to what you're going to be doing, confirm, yes, this is required, this makes sense, this fits within our standards for something that you can do as part of your requirement toward graduation. So, most often, of course, people will be doing CPT, if they're doing CPT, to work an internship at some third party company, right? Maybe you get an internship at a local company doing some mechanical engineering work because you're in a mechanical engineering degree. There's nothing inherently that indicates, however, that you couldn't do CPT to work at a company that you have an ownership interest in. A lot of these things are a little bit of a sliding scale, right? I mean, if you have a 100% ownership interest in this company and there is nothing else at the company other than you, that's going to be really difficult to demonstrate that you can meet the CPT requirements. This is an actual internship. You're getting some sort of training that's going to advance your knowledge toward whatever degree program. Those things, there's a real bona fide job offer there from a company. Those things are going to be really hard to show because you're like, there is no company other than me 100% owning it and me being the only person who could do any work for it. So, in that scenario, CPT may be quite difficult. But if you have co-founders, if those co-founders have qualifications in areas that are similar to the one that you're working on, getting a degree in, then you could potentially set up a structure in which you can do an internship at that company that you have an ownership interest in order to gain some knowledge, advance something that is important for the company and also can align with what you're doing your degree in. Maybe it's in management or a degree in finance or something like that, and you're working on aspects related to it. The ultimate arbiter of whether that makes sense is going to be within the school, right? It's going to be, does the department accept that this is part of the credit that I can get toward my degree? And does the DSO look at the structure and say, okay, I can see that there's a real job offer there, that you're really going to be doing an internship. So CPT is one option. But because of those, I guess, restrictions about how you've got to relate to the company, CPT before you graduate may not be as attractive to work for a startup at, for your startup at. The other option before you graduate is OPT, optional practical training. I guess by definition here, pre-completion OPT, right? Pre-graduation OPT. You could do that as well. The process to get CPT is a little bit more straightforward. In order to get CPT, you need authorization from the school and you need the DSO to approve it. In order to get pre-completion OPT, you actually need to apply to USCIS, to US Immigration Services, to get an employment authorization document. So first you need the DSO at your school, the designated school official for immigration, to say, sure, this idea, this work that you want to do is in some way related to your degree, and therefore you can do it. You get an I-20 that authorizes you for that work, and then you have to actually apply for the EAD. So it takes a little bit more time to get the pre-completion OPT EAD. But OPT, unlike CPT, doesn't have a lot of guardrails around the relationship between the company and the employee, right? And you as the individual. You're doing pre-completion OPT, the law doesn't require that you're doing some sort of specific internship in which you're reporting to somebody at the company and getting training and having an employer-employee relationship with a separate person at the company. You could quite transparently be the 100% owner with no other people working at the company, but have a business plan about what you're going to be doing and do pre-completion OPT to carry out those activities. So it's a good option if you're very early in the startup phase and you've got a really good idea and you feel like the iron is hot and you want to do some active work for this company beyond just having it formed. It could be a good option to get pre-completion OPT to do it. The biggest drawback for pre-completion OPT is that OPT is a single well. You get 12 months of OPT when you're associated with any degree program at a certain level that you're earning. So if you're getting a bachelor's degree in software engineering, then related to that program, you're going to get 12 months of OPT, whether it's post-completion or pre-completion, which means if you spend 4 months before you graduate working for the company in pre-completion OPT, then you only have 8 months left of post-completion OPT. So it's important not to use up all of your pre-completion OPT, because if you do, then you won't have any post-completion OPT. And I will talk a little bit in a moment about the STEM extension, but if you don't have post-completion OPT, then you can't be in post-completion OPT, which means you can't apply for the STEM extension. If you use up 12 months before you graduate, you may be giving up 36 months after you graduate. So it doesn't make sense to do that as much in pre-completion. But if you have a few months of work to do, maybe you're close to graduation, I'm a semester away, but my idea is ripe, I need to be working on this now, pre-completion OPT might be a good option because it doesn't have that internship relationship requirement that CPT does. One other thing to mention about CPT is in CPT, not OPT, in CPT, you can do as much CPT as you want before you graduate. But if you do 12 months of CPT, then you forfeit the ability to use post-completion OPT. So it's a really bad idea probably to do 12 plus months of full-time of what F1 status considers full-time CPT. Full-time in the definition of an F1 student from an employment perspective is 20 hours a week. So if you did quote unquote full-time pre-completion CPT, then for 12 months or 13 months, then you get 0 post-completion OPT. But if you do 11 months of pre-completion CPT, then you get 12 months of post-completion OPT, right? It's like an on or an off switch. So whereas OPT, pre-completion, post-completion draws from the same well, CPT and OPT draw from different wells. But if you fill up CPT to 12 months, you get none of OPT. So important thing to think about if you're kind of trying to balance, here's where I am. I'm in a 2-year master's program, starting to work with a couple friends on a really cool idea. I need to be able to work for this company now before I graduate. Number one, I can found it. Don't have a problem with that. Number two, if I have some co-founders and I got some defined projects that I can work on from an internship perspective, from a learning perspective on specific technical work I can do, and somebody else at the company who can manage that work for me or manage me while I'm doing it, I might be able to use pre-completion CPT. If I really need that flexibility to operate in a more high-level business perspective, for my own company, then maybe it's pre-completion OPT. But I want to make sure I'm not using 12 months of either of those things for different reasons, because I want to make sure I give myself the opportunity after I graduate to use post-completion OPT. So then you graduate. After you graduate, now you've got a couple different options. You don't have CPT anymore, but you've got, like I said, post-completion OPT. Hopefully, maybe you've got 12 months left. Maybe you got something less because you really needed to use it before you graduated. There's a timeline, which I think you guys will likely be aware of already, but just a very high level go over. Before you graduate, in the kind of 90-day window before you graduate, that's when you can begin applying for post-completion OPT. And it makes sense to do it, right, as early as possible in that timeline. Most schools, and I think UB is one of them, although, I'm an external immigration attorney here who, I don't control or have any decision making on how UB as an office, as a school, as the DSO will handle things. I've got some information from having spoken to them, but ultimately it's up to them to decide. But my understanding is, the DSO, what they want is they want some sort of offer letter for a position that is transparently in an area that's related to your degree. They want that to have a start date. They want it to have a company. And beyond that, because it's OPT, as long as they can see, they can understand from what you're showing them that it's work within your field. And by within your field, I mean, let's say you got a degree in finance and you're starting a company that's doing some financial consulting or analysis, or you got a degree in software engineering and you're just doing any sort of app-based startup or product development or something. It's just got to be something related to what you learned in your degree program. Then I think that that's all they really need to be able to say, I have enough to show you've got a real legit OPT opportunity, and authorize, issue the I-20 to authorize that OPT. It doesn't have to be that you have a company that's been operating for 12 years and demonstrates strong finances to be able to show, hey, I can do the OPT from them. I don't need that third party offer letter. I need an offer letter, perhaps from a company that I 100% own, as long as I can show the work I'm going to do is related to my degree. And I've got a real offer letter, right? Like this company really exists. And I've got a start date and the name and all those details. So the reason to apply for that OPT as early as possible, maybe 90 days or early within that 90-day window before you graduate, is that it's going to take time for the DSO to review and approve, for you to get the I-20, for you to then, I say mail, I guess now you could do it online. So for you to submit the application to immigration for the employment authorization document, and then for immigration to review and issue the document. They do allow you to what's called premium process that application now. Normal processing times maybe a few months, but you can pay an additional fee and they'll do it within 30 business days. So probably if you apply early enough before graduation, there's a very little time post-graduation where you don't yet have your EAD. But that time post-graduation where you don't yet have your EAD, you can't work yet, right? You might say, hey, I've got my I-20 approved, I've graduated, I'm ready to start doing my work, but until you get the EAD issued for OPT, you can't start working. Once you do, great, now you can start working. OPT, unlike, and I guess I should have mentioned this about CPT. CPT could be an unpaid internship, right? But there has to be some idea, some information about what is the employment relationship in the CPT application. So it could be potentially unpaid, it could be paid. The government, immigration, doesn't limit that. OPT also could be unpaid work. Probably if you get kind of an arm's length third-party company offer, there's going to be some payment involved, right? You've graduated with your degree, you're starting as a mechanical engineer at this company, they're offering you a certain salary. As long as that salary is reasonable, great, you don't have an issue. But it's OPT, which means they don't even have to offer you a salary. They could just say, do this work for me for free. Probably the third-party company wouldn't do that, but your own startup, right? The company you own 67% in, you could say, I could just work for this company and bootstrap this company without taking a salary. And that's totally fine. Immigration isn't imposing a salary requirement, but immigration is imposing a requirement that you actually do the work. There's a limit of how much time you can be unemployed in OPT. I believe off the top of my head, it's 90 days during your regular OPT period. And if you then apply for the STEM extension, which I'll talk about in a moment, there's an additional 60 days of unemployment that you could have during the STEM extension period for a total of 150 days. I think that's accurate. I guess I don't know off the top of my head. I should have double checked which order that was in. But overall, it's like 90 plus 60 equals 150, or 60 plus 90 equals 150. But there's a limit of the number of unemployment days you can have. And that's important for you to understand if you're working for your own company and you're not getting paid. Because how does anybody know whether you're doing any work for them? If I, immigration officer, a year from when you started, I'm now reviewing an application from you to change your status from F1 to, let's say, H1B, and you're saying, hey, I've been working for this startup for the last 12 months. How do I know you have? How do I know you've maintained your status? The most obvious, simple way would be show me your pay stubs. Great. I see your bi-weekly pay stubs. You're maintaining status. I don't have any pay stubs. I just work for myself. Burden is on you to prove that you're maintaining your status, right? So if you're going to be working for your own startup in OPT, I strongly encourage you, keep contemporaneous records of your time, right? At the time, you have your offer letter that said you were going to start on July 7th. Starting July 7th, you maybe use some time tracking software or something. And every week or every couple of weeks, keep a record of those things. If you are doing product development, I know not everybody goes and does startup work or graduates with a degree in kind of technology or AI or engineering. But if you are, then keep track of the project development, the product development cycle that you're following. Have some sort of records that you're actually doing that work, because you may be asked to prove it. And if so, you're in a much better position if your proof is evidence that was created over time through the time that you were working, than now looking back and saying, oh yeah, I got all this stuff done. Okay, so that's OPT, right? You can do that work for 12 months. Great. You can work for your own startup. You can build the company. If you got a degree, if the degree that you earned was in science, technology, engineering, math, then you could potentially extend your OPT work authorization for 2 additional years through what's called the STEM extension. I mentioned it a couple times before. Unlike OPT, STEM extension, the STEM OPT does have requirements about the relationship between you and the company, about the nature of your employment, about how much you were compensated. So when you're trying to file for the STEM extension, you now need to be able to show that during that STEM extension period, there's a real employer that is separate from you. And that employer has the ability to control your work. And that employer has sufficient institutional knowledge and capacity to be able to train you in your field so that you can gain additional knowledge and training in your field, and that employer can compensate you a reasonable amount, right? There's no kind of hard line number that they tie this to. It just says a reasonable amount. So when you're doing the STEM extension, now you're going to need to, in some sense, similar to what we talked about in the CPT, have ideally some structure within your company to be able to report to somebody, to be able to be periodically reviewed, to have targets that you're meeting in terms of your training, in terms of the work that you're doing. So what does it normally look like? Well, let's say you graduate and you're 100% owner of a company and you're like, I'm just starting my own company. That's fine. You got 12 months, right? Do post-completion OPT, build for 12 months as much as you can. By the time you get to the STEM extension, to needing to apply for it, by that time, hopefully the startup is going well, right? If it's going well enough that you can say, look, I've got some advisors. I can dilute perhaps my ownership with some co-founders, or I had some investors that dilutes my ownership. I mean, you want to be in one of these kinds of positions because it's going to be very difficult if you're the 100% owner at that point. It's not impossible, because the question wasn't, do you 100% own the company? The question was, does the company control your employment? Which you could impose. You could create a structure in which the company controls your employment despite your ownership. But in an ideal world, you have some dilution of ownership definitely some dilution of control so that you can show in the STEM extension application, I'm actually reporting to this other person. That person's got qualifications that are related to my degree because they've got to be able to mentor me. This is the work I'm going to do. This is how I'm going to be measured. This is how I'm going to be compensated. If you can do that, you can get the 2-year STEM extension. Post-graduation, that is commonly what the path people will follow, right? Before you graduate, you might do pre-completion OPT, you might do CPT. After you graduate, you got post-completion OPT, you got the STEM extension. At some point, if you're going to want to stay in the US for longer, maybe you're building the company and you want to stay because the company's doing well, maybe this is just where you want to continue to live and grow and work. At some point, you're going to run out of OPT time, right? Run out of F1 time. You got 3 years post-graduation if you have a STEM degree. It's only 1 year post-graduation if you don't. The most common path that people next try to take is the H-1B because it's the most generally applicable type of status in the US for a professional. It requires that you have a degree in a specific field. It requires that the job needed you to have that degree and that there really is a bona fide job offer. There's real work for you to do. It doesn't anymore require that you have those kind of complex structures of an employer-employee relationship that we talked about for the STEM, right? If we were having this conversation 4 months ago, 3 months ago, I would have said, hey, the H-1B requires an employer-employee relationship, put the same structure in place, maybe a board of directors, an employment agreement, dilution of control, all of these kinds of things that you might do for the STEM extension. Today, I don't say that because as of January 17th, they updated the rules for the H-1B to no longer require this investigation of the employer-employee relationship. Now the question is there a real company, right? Is that company actually formed in existence in the US? Does the company have real work for you to do? Is that work in a field that requires a degree? Do you have that degree, right? Those are the questions, not, and do you own that company? You could own it 100%, right? So there's a little bit of a quirk here, right? You might be an OPT where you can own 100%, need to go to STEM OPT where you can't own 100%, or at least if you did own 100%, you have to have some complicated structures to make sure that you're still not in control of your own employment. And then you go to H-1B where you can own 100% again. Probably, hopefully, in your startup life cycle, by the time you're 3 or 4 years into the company, there's going to be some dilution because you've got external investment, you've got work that you're doing and equity perhaps that you're giving to employees and other things. So probably naturally you'll have some dilution here anyway. But this is something you've got to address in the STEM extension period. But in the H-1B period, you can work for the company and you can own the company 100%. The restriction that the new rule structure sets on you is that they're only going to approve that H for 18 months. And then after 18 months, they want to see again, hey, look, the job's still real, as the company still exists, and then I'll approve it for another 18 months. And then after that, you go back to the kind of standard H-1B timeline of getting an approval at most for 3 years. Obviously, maybe not obviously, sorry, I guess I don't know how much you guys are aware of the structures and systems. I find that a lot of people already, especially in foreign national students, already have a good idea of some of these general ideas. So I say obviously, but maybe not. The H-1B has some randomness to it because they limit how many of them they issue each year. We just now, a week and a bit ago, had the lottery, the random selection for this year. They selected, well, they probably actually selected more than, but they ultimately are attempting to select 65,000 new individuals to get H-1B status and 20,000 more who have US master's degrees. Way more than that apply, right? They haven't put the stats out this year, but in previous years, it's 300,000 or 400,000 people applying for these 85,000 positions. So you might not get selected. If you get selected, great. That's a good option. It's a good pathway. You build in for yourself an additional 6 years of work authorization. If you don't get selected, there are other options. And even if you were to be selected, for people from some countries, there are other better options. If you are the 100% owner of your business, or at least the 50+% owner of your business, and you're from a country with which we have a treaty, and we have treaties with lots of different countries. We don't have treaties for this topic with India or China. That's probably the biggest subset of people who are here and trying to apply for these. So, if you're from India or China, what I'm about to say next doesn't apply to you, but if you're from the UK or Germany or Pakistan or Australia or Canada or a lot of other different countries, we have a treaty with the country to establish that if there's a business that's at least 50% owned by somebody from that country, and that person has made a substantial investment in establishing the business in the US, and that business is growing, is going to create more jobs than just the job for that individual themselves and their family, then you can obtain an E visa, an E2 visa to do that work. So it's a completely coherent, and we work with several people to do this, a completely coherent timeline to say in post-completion OPT, I'm founding the business, I'm working on the business. Maybe I put some of my own money into the business, but maybe I'm also putting some equity, some sweat equity into the business, some IP into the business. And I'm establishing that I initially, as this person from Germany, I'm doing the investment of my, ideally some money, but also time and effort. And then as a result of my work, as a result of my investment, I seek outside investment, and those other investors come in, and maybe they come in with more money, but they came in after I put mine in. You might then, after you complete OPT, say, hey, I can apply for an E2 because now I've gotten, the investment I need to make the business run, but crucially, I made the initial investment. So that's potentially a good alternative option to the H. Another alternative option to the H, I think a lot of people who have heard, is the O1 for extraordinary ability. I would say in the very early days of the Trump administration, we are seeing maybe more scrutiny on the O1 than we did through Trump 1 and through Biden, right? In those last 8 years, we saw more and more that the government was more liberal, I guess, even with the first Trump administration. So it's not necessarily a political position, but they were more liberal on what it took to establish that you meet the criteria for the O1. The criteria are the same as they have been, specific regulations criteria, but whether they believe that something satisfies the criteria was something that we were seeing pretty liberal in its analysis. And now just in these first few months, we're seeing a lot more pushback. Is that anecdotal? Is that just a few cases? I don't know. We'll start seeing a trend as we go forward, but the O1 is a possible other option you might work on or think about. I can talk about that if people have questions about it in the second half. But that's basically what I wanted to go through. There's a whole set of things we can talk about from a green card perspective as well, but I don't know if that's going to become relevant to people here. The most important thing that I'm trying to convey in going through all these details is at every stage here, it is possible for you to obtain work authorization, obtain status while you're working on a startup that you're yourself founding, right? You can own the company before you come to the US, while you're a student in the US, after you graduated. You can start working for the company while you're a student, potentially in CPT if you set the structures up right, definitely in pre-completion OPT. You can continue working for the company post-completion OPT, regardless of your ownership, regardless of your relationship, regardless of how much you get paid. You need to have specific structures in place to make sure you can meet the requirements for the STEM extension if you're going to be a founder and an owner. But you can do it. We work with lots of people who do. If you are able to get into the H-1B lottery, you now can just work for a company that is a company you own and majority control, as long as you can show the work that you're doing, that it requires a degree, that it really exists, it's a bona fide job offer. And there may be some other options outside of the H as well, in which you can work for a company that you found. And so I guess our primary purpose in kind of doing this discussion was trying to make sure that you're aware of all of these different options, that founding a company is an option, and how that might work and what the considerations you might have. So that's what I wanted to talk about initially. Like I said, I've got a couple other things I could say about the green card process and about some details here. But I guess I'll go back to Andrew now and see, are there questions that people have shared, or maybe people might have who are still here in the chat that they want to discuss?
Yeah, we've got some questions that submitted that we'll kind of start with those. First one that we have is, how do you proceed with your idea if you are a student with F1 visa, have SSN, and have a full-time job on campus, can you co-partner with a US citizen?
So the part about that question I didn't quite hear properly was after you said a student on F1 visa, what was the next thing you said? Have
Um,
SSN?
with an SSN, yep,
I see,
and
I
a
see.
full-time job on campus.
Okay, so I guess the most likely thing I would say is first, if you have a co-founder that you're working with, I mean, you could just found the business, like I said earlier, and you don't have to, as long as you're not necessarily doing any day-to-day active work at the beginning, just found the business, keep doing your full-time on-campus role, and have your co-founder begin the active work. If you need to do active day-to-day work, then you've got to do one of those two things that I mentioned earlier. You've got to either get pre-completion OPT or CPT. I probably recommend that you see how hands-off you can be at the beginning. Because especially if you've got a co-founder, because if you don't have to take advantage of those of pre-completion OPT, then it might be nicer to not, because then you'll have the full 12 months after you graduate. And so that's what I would say. But I mean, having the SSN, I guess, is valuable because you might need an SSN in order to be an actual owner of a company of a certain legal structure. But it's not the critical thing, right? Like your co-founder could form the company. You could apply for an ITIN to be an owner of a company.
Great, thank you. Next question we have, which might be a little bit trickier, is that as an international student at F1 visa, what are the chances of me to get into the current market, particularly the tech market, with an idea and then make a place for my startup?
I mean, I guess the part about this that I would try to maybe push back a little bit on is the framing and the focus on the as an international student in the F1 with an F1, right? Because I think there are structures like I've talked about today that can enable you to do work for a company that you found, whether you're an F1 student, whether you're an F1 who's graduated and now in your post-completion OPT period. I think the bigger difficulty is how do you break into the current market with your startup idea, right? I mean, that's the same difficulty that a US founder, like a US citizen founder has for their idea, right? I would say that's probably the bigger difficulty. How can you do it as the F1 foreign national student? Oh, come up with your idea, come up with your business plan, come up with your pitch deck for potential investors. These are all things that you might be able to do before you even form the company, right? You're just testing, doing some potential research in the market for, is this an idea that people are going to want or have an appetite for? And then when you're at a point where you're saying, I'm doing some work, I'm doing some development, trying to work on getting either the CPT, OPT, H1B, or whatever it might be.
So looks like next question we have is our questioner is asking, they are looking for a summer internship and found a startup based out of New York. Startup is very early stages. Looks like they have CEO and CRO, and they want this student to join as a CTO. However, they're not sure they can work as a co-founder or CTO on an F1 visa as an international student. Would they?
Yeah. So this is a scenario, and I guess I didn't focus on this a lot, even though I did want to talk about it a little bit today. This is a scenario where the student isn't actually founding a company. They just want to work at a startup company, right? Be one of the early employees of the company. So the first thing is if you don't have any ownership interest in the company, or at least minimal ownership interest to begin with, maybe you'll join some employee stock option pool or get some initial grant equity. Then all of those different considerations I had earlier, where I talked about employer-employee relationship, et cetera, those things don't really matter. So what's important here is if it's a summer internship, I suspect that means it's possibly pre-completion OPT. It's possibly a CPT thing. I mean, I guess a summer internship could be something that a degree program requires, right, in order for you to graduate. So I might first look to my department that I'm working with to get my whatever major I'm majoring in to say, hey, can I do this as part of, an independent study or part of a class, a course related to the degree. And if you can, then get an internship agreement from the company to do that work in CPT. And can you be the CTO? I mean, I think you probably could. The question is, what other qualifications do those other people have? What is your degree in? And how is it that you're actually getting some supervision and training? What's the relationship between you and the other people working at that company to show that it's some growth and learning that you're doing that could advance your knowledge toward your degree. A lot of times in my experience in startups, that title and a lot of these titles, just the titles you use because you're at a company, because there's three people, you might be called CTO, but day to day, you're just doing all the same work any other software engineer would do. And so I think what matters is what is the work you're doing and who do you report to and what's your relationship there.
Awesome. So next question, I think we touched upon it a little bit towards the end of your discussion, but we have a student who's asking the question, how does the F1 to H1B to green card transition work?
The F1 to H1B is pretty straightforward. The biggest complexity on the F1 to H1B is being able to get an H1B, right? In order to be able to obtain an H1B, you have to be either selected in the lottery, and the lottery happens every March, April. Some 85,000 H1Bs are assigned, and like I said, 400,000 people apply. Or the employer that you work for has to be exempt from requiring you to go through the lottery. So maybe they're an educational research institution, or there's some government research institution. There's some nonprofit that does research of some kind, or there are institutions that are exempt from the H-1B, and therefore you might do that transition in that way. If you then leave that company, by the way, if you go to a cap exempt institution and then later want to transfer to your H-1B to a cap subject institution, then you got to go through the lottery before you can do the transfer. You could do concurrent employment at the same time as the cap exempt, but you couldn't use going to a cap exempt employer as a way to skip going through the lottery, is my point. So the transition from F1 to H1B is reasonably straightforward. While you're in F1 still in your OPT, you'll register for the lottery. Perhaps you'll be in your OPT or your STEM, or maybe you're still in school and you're in CPT, but you've got a prior degree, so you at least have a bachelor's. Once you get selected in the lottery or you find a cap exempt employer, they file an H-1B petition, change your status, or maybe they file the petition, you go get a visa stamp, come back. Transition to green card is more a complicated question because there are multiple different pathways to a green card. If we're talking an employment-based pathway, then either you're trying to show, hey, look, whatever field you're working in, you're somebody who's got extraordinary ability, and therefore you should be eligible for this first preference green card. Or the employer that you're working for is showing, I have a permanent job offer available for this person. Maybe they're here on the H-1B, but they don't have to be. But let's say maybe they're here on the H-1B. I want to employ them permanently in this role. And for the employer to do that, to get the approval from Department of Labor and Immigration to offer that job to the foreign national, they've got to go through a whole process of trying to recruit for the position, proving to the Department of Labor they couldn't find an American, and then proving to immigration that they could actually afford to pay the new employee. And so if it's just one of those standard, what we call perm-based green cards, then that's a long-term process. That may take a couple of years for the employer to get through it. Then you can apply for the green card. If you had extraordinary ability, you don't need the employer. You can just go straight to try and petition the government to say, look, I got extraordinary ability. The super frustrating for many people, and I guess additional complexity here, is you could follow those steps I just described, but if you are born in certain countries, then there's such a demand for people from those countries for green cards of that category that there's a massive backlog. And, for example, if you were born in India and you had an employer that gave you a permanent job offer, went to Department of Labor, went to immigration, got all the approvals, it's what we call either third or second preference. And there's maybe a 12-year backlog before a green card's available. And so you're in this cycle of extending your H-1B for 12 years. What does the transition look like? Relatively easy from F1 to H-1B. From H-1B to green card, more complexity, potentially a much longer timeline.
Okay. Another question's come through, might be more specific for UB, but does doing experiential learning at UB count CPT unpaid and just for the experience and related fee? That might be a question, I feel like, for international student services, but not sure.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the school's decision is on whether that is something that they would approve for CPT. But if they would, then the school is the arbiter of that. So if doing that experiential learning is something that they can identify as part of a degree program that's related to your education, you get credit for it, then you could do it as CPT. I guess I'd need to know the particulars, and also I wouldn't be the one to be able to decide on that. Schools make different decisions on that, and frankly, departments make different decisions on that within schools as well.
So I think we have time for like one more question, which we do have in here. Is the transition from the first year of OPT to the STEM transition easy, assuming everything is in order on a legal standpoint?
Yes. I mean, your last assumption, you're hiding a lot there, but yeah, assuming everything is in order, it's a very simple transition. But, to put some more flavor on that, basically to file for the STEM extension, there's a couple of steps you have to take, right? First, you have to, I say first, right? I guess you could do some of these in slightly different order, but what I'd suggest is first, you have to go to your employer and ensure that your employer is willing to complete the paperwork for the STEM extension, right? And there is paperwork there. For the regular OPT, all the employer had to do is give you a job offer with a start date, your name, maybe a compensation detail, but that's it, right? For the STEM extension, your employer has to complete a training plan. And the training plan is not some nebulous generic document. It is a specific immigration form, right? It's a form that has some 4 or 5 pages. There's a couple different areas of those pages for the employer to fill out. And so you need to draft the training plan. And that draft is going to include, what are your job duties going to be? What are the measures and assessments that the employer is going to use to evaluate your performance? How frequently are you going to have interaction with your managers? Things like that. So first you get the training plan done. Maybe that takes a little while. So maybe it takes a week or 2 with your employer to get a draft together. Then you go with the training plan to your DSO and you say, hey, look, I got this training plan. This employer is giving me the offer to kind of do the STEM extension. And the DSO is going to review, and they may have questions. And ultimately, the DSO is the decider on whether this training plan is sufficient or not. Usually, and as far as I know, in every experience I've had with the UB DSOs, the people who are going to look at this, try and understand it, work with you to make sure that they get the details they need. So maybe you share with them the training plan and they'll come back and say, I don't have enough information about X, or I need some more detail on Y, something like that. And then you might need to go back to the employer and say, can we refine this? So then it's possible that there's a little bit of back and forth. Once the DSO is satisfied, employer's got to sign it, employee's got to sign it, DSO's got to sign it. And then the DSO is going to put it up into CVIS, right, into the Student Exchange Visitor Information System. And they will then issue the I-20. Once you get the I-20, you as the student now have an obligation, right? You now have to take that I-20 and actually apply for the EAD, or the employment authorization document. You got to submit that application to immigration. It costs, I think, $520, $470 if you do it online. And you've got to, in that application, submit details about the employer, et cetera, about your current status, all this stuff. Not super complicated. Frankly, this is something that many, many people do without hiring a lawyer to help them, right? So this is something that it is possible to do between yourselves, your employer, and your DSO. But if you do all those steps, which perhaps by describing them I make sound complicated, but aren't necessarily super complicated, if you can do all those things, you'll get a receipt notice from the government. As long as your receipt notice is dated before the expiration date on your OPT EAD, you're in good shape. Even if it takes the government longer to actually adjudicate, you get an automatic extension of your work authorization for up to 180 days while they're adjudicating. So the transition is actually very smooth. You just, in the 90 days before your OPT expires, you start taking care of all these things, make sure you submit it on time, and then you keep working smoothly. The key question, especially if you're working for your own startup, for your own company, a company that you have ownership interest in, is getting the approval from the DSO for the structure, for the details. It's not every DSO that's going to care about your ownership, because in some sense, ownership isn't something that the government explicitly indicates is a problem for a STEM extension. What they care about is, what is that training plan? What is that relationship between the employer and the employee? Is there somebody at the employer that has the knowledge, the ability to be a mentor, to actually provide additional training? How are you being measured? So whether you own 80%, 20%, or 0%, you're going to need to be able to show those things. And depending on the DSO, they may ask no questions about the ownership structure. They may say, hey, I want to understand this. But either way, it's that kind of training plan that's important. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that makes sense based off the context. Well, then I think we've reached our time for this evening. First of all, I just want to say thank you so very much for taking the time to kind of walk us through that process, kind of giving us some ideas of how this works when it relates to entrepreneurship and startups. Those of you who are attended, thank you so much for taking the time out of your evening to join us. We'll be making this recording hopefully available relatively soon. Otherwise, just want to say thank you again for the talk this evening, and thank you all for attending.